The mansion had not heard laughter in years. Its marble halls stood like a mausoleum, echoing only the soft shuffle of staff who walked as though sound itself might break something fragile. In a corner office high above the ocean cliffs, Samuel Whitaker signed contracts with the same precision he once used to fold paper cranes with his husband. Once, this place was filled with sunlight and music. Once, Ethan's laughter had spilled through the kitchen like warm honey while their two boys toddled underfoot. Then, on the boy's birthday, the world shattered. Ethan's private plane fell from the sky and never came back. That day, balloons wilted in silence while Samuel held two screaming children in his arms and knew nothing would ever taste like joy again. He did not grieve. He calcified. He stopped celebrating birthdays, stopped walking barefoot on the grass, stopped looking anyone in the eye. Jack and Theo, barely old enough to spell their own names, learned silence from him. They stopped speaking. They stopped smiling. Even their toys gathered dust like small tombstones on the shelves. Tutors came and left with pity in their eyes. Therapists whispered about trauma, and a long parade of nannies arrived full of color, only to flee within weeks in tears, unable to breathe the grief hanging in the air like thick smoke. Samuel buried himself in work, as if enough success could erase death. He built empires from behind cold glass walls, surrounded by people who bowed to him yet never touched his heart. But every night he stood outside the twins' door, listening to the weight of their silence, and walked away because he no longer knew how to be anyone's father. His staff began to speak of the boys in hushed voices, as though naming them might summon more sorrow. They ate alone. They played alone. They grew like shadows clinging to the edges of the house that once was a home. Then, one autumn morning, the chief housekeeper entered Samuel's study. Her hands trembled on the folder she held, as if the paper itself carried risk. She said the agency had sent a new nanny, the last on their list. A man. Samuel barely looked up from his laptop. He murmured a distracted fine. But then she added, voice shrinking, that he would arrive with a baby of his own. Samuel's pen froze midair. His gaze lifted slowly, sharp as fractured glass. A man bringing an infant into this house of ghosts. It sounded like chaos. It sounded like sunlight cracking through stone. For a long moment, Samuel said nothing. His jaw locked as if he might shatter his teeth. Then he exhaled once through his nose and turned back to his screen. 1 week, he muttered. If he fails, he leaves. The housekeeper nodded and left quickly, leaving behind the faintest whiff of hope, quickly swallowed by the sterile air. In that instant, Samuel told himself this was just another transaction, a temporary solution. But somewhere behind the steel doors of his chest, something thin and aching stirred. A man carrying his own abandoned child was about to walk into a house that had forgotten how to love. And Samuel, who had buried every scrap of softness he ever had, was about to learn whether a heart could thaw once it had turned to ice. If you want to see how this frozen house begins to breathe again, follow Heart Stories, because sometimes the bravest thing is letting love back in. Adrian Carter arrived on a gray morning that smelled faintly of salt and rain. He stepped out of the car with only a weathered leather suitcase and a small bassinet cradled carefully in his arms. Inside it, wrapped in a pale knitted blanket, lay Oliver, his newly adopted son, rescued from a state shelter where babies waited for names longer than they waited for love. Adrian's presence was soft without being timid, like light falling on still water. He didn't glance at the marble columns or the acres of manicured lawns as most new hires did. His eyes only moved between the sleeping infant and the looming doorway that guarded the Whitaker estate like a fortress. Samuel watched from the top of the grand staircase, a still figure carved from stone. His voice cut through the silence, cold and exacting. He reminded Adrian that this was a place of work, not a charity. This is a bum, not a refuge, he said flatly, though his gaze flickered with something unreadable as it landed on Oliver's tiny fists curled like seashells. The chief housekeeper hovered anxiously behind Adrian, ready to shield him from rejection. But Adrian only nodded with quiet steadiness. He did not defend himself or plead his case. He simply said he would do his best, and if his best was not enough, he would leave. Samuel allowed him 1 week, no more. Jack and Theo regarded Adrian with the distant wariness of wild creatures. They did not speak or even look fully at him, only watched from the corners of rooms as he moved through their world like a soft draft. They stared longer at Oliver, their gazes tight with confusion, as if trying to understand why someone so small belonged to the man who now prepared their meals and folded their blankets. Adrian never reached for them. He did not try to coax smiles or force conversation. Instead, he settled quietly into the rhythm of the household, tending to Oliver with a serenity that seemed immune to the heavy air. He read stories aloud in a low voice on the rug of the playroom, not looking up to see if anyone listened. He rearranged their forgotten plush animals into tidy rows without comment. He warmed milk in the kitchen while the boys lingered in the doorway like ghosts, eyes flicking between his hands and the sleeping baby. Days passed, and the house did not erupt as Samuel had predicted. Instead, it began to hum faintly with something new, almost imperceptible. One evening, long after the children had been tucked into their rooms, Samuel walked down the corridor outside the nursery. The house was hushed except for the crackle of the distant fireplace. He paused when a sound floated through the door, thin and sudden, then growing like the fragile start of music. Laughter, not Oliver's soft coos, but high-pitched, stumbling laughter spilling from the throats of Jack and Theo. Samuel stopped mid-step, his hand tightening on the polished banister as though it might keep him from falling. The sound cut straight through the crust of his composure and left him breathless. He stood motionless in the shadowed hallway, listening as if the walls themselves might collapse if he moved. Then, just as quickly as it came, the laughter faded back into whispers. Samuel exhaled sharply and turned away, forcing his stride to remain measured. In his mind, he told himself it was nothing, only an accident of timing, an echo of something fleeting. Yet as he returned to his office, the sound clung to him like the faint trace of summer on cold skin. Unwanted but impossible to ignore. He worked late into the night, but his thoughts kept circling back to the quiet man who carried an unwanted baby into a house steeped in grief and who, without demanding anything, had stirred a sliver of life where there had only been silence. What Samuel did not realize yet was that healing often begins not with noise or triumph, but with small moments gently repeated until they feel safe. And safety, once felt, can become the first step back toward love. Morning came softly, filtered through gauzy curtains as if the sun itself was hesitant to disturb the fragile balance that had begun to form inside the Whitaker estate. Jack and Theo were on the rug, their small frames folded in concentration as they gathered scattered cloths from the floor. They were not speaking, yet something had shifted. Their movements were no longer aimless. They stacked the cloths in a crooked tower beside Adrian, who was rocking Oliver with one arm while sorting tiny socks with the other. When the boys placed the last cloth at his feet, Adrian only gave a small nod, the faintest trace of a smile touching his lips. He did not applaud them or break the stillness with praise. Instead, he murmured, "I like how you did that," so gently that it felt like a secret meant only for them. The days stretched quietly like this, each one planting something invisible. Jack began carrying his stuffed bear to the bassinet, leaving it near Oliver's feet before backing away like a visitor offering tribute. Theo learned to fetch Oliver's blanket from the laundry room and draped it clumsily across the bassinet rail, cheeks flushed from the weight of his own courage. There was no ceremony, no sudden flood of words, only these small, precise gestures that carried the shape of care. The boys did not know how to explain what was happening to them. They only knew that Adrian never pushed, never filled the silences with noise, never tried to make their sadness disappear. He simply stayed, and somehow that made the silence less sharp. Samuel watched from a distance, as though proximity might fracture the scene. His presence hovered at the edges of rooms, caught between longing and fear. Work no longer consumed him fully. Contracts blurred on the screen as his eyes drifted toward the playroom camera feed glowing faintly in the corner of his office. He saw his sons kneeling on the floor like two fragile saplings bending towards sunlight, and something inside him twisted. It had been years since he sat at their level, years since he risked being clumsy or soft. One evening, Adrian left a box of colored bricks open on the carpet, their bright edges catching the amber light. Jack reached in, picked out a block, and turned it over in his palm as if testing its weight. Theo watched, still and silent, until Jack crawled across the rug and placed the brick at the base of a half-built tower. Adrian said nothing, only continued defaulting laundry. The tower wobbled, then held. Jack looked toward the doorway, where Samuel stood half-hidden, his posture taut like a wire stretched too thin. Samuel stepped inside before he could change his mind. The rug felt foreign under his polished shoes. He crouched stiffly, unsure where to place his hands. His breathing came shallow, as if the air might not hold him here. Then Jack picked up another block, crossed the small gap between them, and pressed it into Samuel's palm. His voice emerged as the softest thread of sound. "Build with me." The words struck like lightning under the ribs. Samuel's throat locked, his vision blurred at the edges. He set the block down with trembling fingers, and Jack smiled, tiny, fleeting, but real. Theo inched closer, then closer still, until the three of them were bent together over the tower, placing one block after another in careful silence, while Oliver dozed in the corner and Adrian watched without interrupting. The moment was so fragile it felt like it could vanish if named, yet it did not. It held, steady as breath. And in that stillness, Samuel felt the faint pulse of something he had buried too deep to recognize, at first belonging. Not the kind forged by blood or contracts, but the kind born when wounded hearts risk touching again. He realized then that children do not need grand gestures to trust someone. They need presence that does not flinch, hands that keep returning even when fear whispers they should pull away. That night, Samuel stayed on the rug long after the tower toppled, learning how to begin again one small piece at a time. The house had changed in ways too delicate to mark on a calendar, yet unmistakable to anyone who listened. Sunlight lingered longer on the staircase, as if the air itself had softened. Jack and Theo no longer moved like phantoms gliding through empty rooms. They padded across the halls with quiet intent, their gazes no longer anchored to the floor. They followed Adrian from room to room, never quite touching him, but orbiting him like small moons tracing an unfamiliar gravity. And wherever Adrian went, Oliver was there too, tucked against his chest or sleeping in his bassinet like a steady heartbeat. One pale morning, Adrian entered the nursery to the sound of paper rustling. The twins were crouched on the floor near Oliver's crib, their brows furrowed in fierce concentration. They had scavenged a sheet of construction paper from the craft cabinet and were pressing markers hard enough to squeak. The letters they drew were crooked and oversized, the lines wobbling from their unpracticed hands. When they finished, they stepped back, breathless with some emotion they didn't name. In uneven black scrawl, the word brother sprawled across the page like a banner. Adrian stopped in the doorway, his hand tightening on the doorframe. For a moment, he could not move. The boys had been silent shadows for so long that the sight of this single word felt louder than any sound. Theo noticed him and flinched, as if caught doing something forbidden. But Jack only lifted his chin with a flicker of defiance and carefully taped the paper to the rail of Oliver's bassinet. The baby stirred, yawned, and settled back into sleep as though blessing the proclamation. The room smelled faintly of milk and crayons and something warmer, something like hope taking root. Samuel appeared behind Adrian, drawn by the strange hush. He stood frozen on the threshold while the boys turned toward him in unison. They did not speak at first. Then Jack crossed the small space between them, grasped Samuel's sleeve, and tugged with quiet insistence. "Dad," he said, the word rough from disuse. "We have a little brother now." Theo nodded, his small jaw trembling as if the weight of saying it out loud might break him. Time fractured. Samuel's eyes darted from their solemn faces to the paper sign trembling faintly in the draft, to the baby gurgling softly beneath it. He sank to his knees without realizing he had moved. the cold marble seeping through his trousers as tears blurred his vision. They came without warning, without permission, hot and unstoppable after years of drought. Jack pressed close to his shoulder. Theo followed, their thin arms wrapping around his ribs with desperate certainty. Samuel's hands rose shakily to hold them both, and he could not stop the sob that broke from him like something ancient cracking open. Across the room, Adrian stood utterly still, his breath caught as if the wrong motion might shatter the moment. For the first time since the crash, the house heard a sound that was not grief disguised as silence. It heard a father weeping not because he had lost everything, but because he had found something he thought was gone forever. He lifted his gaze to Adrian through the blur and spoke in a voice scraped raw. "Thank you for teaching them how to love again." Adrian did not answer. He only gave the smallest nod, as if acknowledging a vow made in the air between them. In that fragile circle on the nursery floor, something irreversible took root. The twins who once flinched from touch now clung with trust. The man who had locked his heart behind marble walls had let it break, and in breaking, let light through. Love had not returned with fanfare or command. It had arrived because someone had been patient enough to keep showing up even when no one reached back. And when children feel safe enough to claim someone as their own, it becomes the truest measure of family, written not in blood, but in the quiet bravery of choosing each other. Life inside the Whitaker estate bloomed with a rhythm no one had dared imagine. The mornings that once tasted like metal now carried the scent of toast and giggles drifting from the kitchen. Samuel read stories at the breakfast table, his voice still halting, but steady enough that Jack leaned against his arm without hesitation. Theo climbed into his lap to point at the pictures while Oliver cooed from his high chair, Adrian's calm presence threading through it all like warm light. Samuel laughed, sometimes short, startled sounds that startled even him. The house, once entombed in grief, pulsed with life as if its walls had learned how to breathe again. But love had barely taken root when the outside world pressed in. The board of Whitaker Global summoned Samuel to a meeting in the city, their suits sharp and their words sharper. They spoke of expansion, of opportunity, of Singapore's emerging markets. They wanted him there for 2 full years. "You are the brand," one executive said, like it was praise, though it landed like a blade. Samuel nodded mechanically, pretending he didn't hear the echo of Jack's laugh in the sterile room. He signed nothing, but they took his silence as consent. On the drive home, the sky hung low and gray, as if it knew something was about to break. That night, Samuel sat in his office while the boys built towers in the nursery. He told himself it was logical. Singapore had better schools, safer neighborhoods, a chance to rebuild the company's edge. Jack and Theo would come with him. He would hire new tutors, new staff, everything they could need. Adrian and Oliver, however, would not. This was his family. He told himself. Oliver was not. And Adrian, no matter how deeply woven into their days, was just an employee. When he called Adrian in, his voice carried the detachment of someone trying to cauterize a wound before it bled. He explained the relocation, the need for a clean separation, the offer of severance generous enough to seem kind. He asked Adrian to leave Oliver behind, as if detaching a leaf from a branch. Adrian went still, his eyes darkened, not with fear but with something sharper. He folded the resignation letter he had already written and set it gently on the desk. His voice was calm, almost tender, yet it struck like thunder. "If you cannot call them a family," he said, "then I will take all 3 where they will be loved as one." The air thinned. Samuel opened his mouth, but the sound that rose was not his. Down the hall came the thunder of small feet. Jack and Theo burst into the room, their faces crumpled, their cheeks wet. They clung to Adrian's legs, sobbing with a raw panic Samuel had not seen even at Ethan's funeral. Their hands clawed at Adrian's shirt as if afraid he would vanish between blinks. Adrian bent to gather them, holding both boys against his chest while Oliver stirred awake from the bassinet in the corner, wailing at the tension that had cracked the air. Samuel's world tilted. The image of the boardroom dissolved, washed away by the sound of his children breaking. They had once been silent statues of grief, and now they were crying for love, as if their hearts would stop if it slipped away. Something inside Samuel finally yielded. The cold scaffolding he had built around his life collapsed like sand. 2 days later, the Whitaker board announced that Samuel had stepped down. He sold his stake, walked into the atrium of the headquarters with Adrian beside him, and in front of every astonished employee, placed a hand on Adrian's back. "This is my husband," he said. Cameras flashed. Gas rippled through the marble hall. Adrian stood steady, one hand resting on Oliver's tiny back, while Jack and Theo clung to their father's coat, their eyes wide with something brighter than joy relief. Back at the estate, the house no longer whispered like a tomb. It rang with the thud of little feet, with bedtime stories and spilled cereal, with the small chaos of living. Samuel no longer stood at the edges of rooms. He sat cross-legged on the rug, while Oliver babbled and the twins wrapped their arms around both him and Adrian. A knot of limbs and laughter that no storm could unravel. Family, he realized, was never about ownership. It was about the courage to choose love when fear tempts you to run. Would you have had the courage to choose love? 2. Follow Heart Stories for more stories that remind us why love chosen bravely is the strongest thing we can build.